There we go. So welcome to all of you. Would love it if everyone could remain muted just so that we can hear each other and not have background noises. I don't know if there's anyone who's calling in from the phone, but if you are, then the mute and unmute are both *6. Can we also just do a test here to see if you can raise your hand? If you go to reactions, which at the bottom bar, there's like a smiley face with a plus. Just everyone, if you're able to raise your hand, just do it real quick. I just want to make sure people can, not everyone I don't think can do it. I just want to know how useful that might be. Okay. Let's move on. So, so when you're speaking or asking a question, make sure you keep your point or your question brief so that we can allow enough time to cover all the topics we'd like to discuss. And then, of course, be respectful when speaking and typing in the chat. Of course, you can type any comments or questions in the chat, and we'll try to integrate those the best we can into the rest of the discussion if you can't or don't want to raise your hand or unmute to speak. And of course, if we don't cover everything, which of course we won't, there'll be plenty more opportunities to provide feedback in the future. We'll have another round of focus groups, we'll have another online survey, we'll have a final public meeting. There's social media, our email account, our website. We'll talk about all that later. So yeah, if we could go to the next slide here. So we will have some online polling that we'll do, and we'll do a test one at the beginning, but that's to start to kind of seed our conversation and just get a sense for where people are at here. And then of course you can use the chat to submit your questions or comments. And then if you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand function, but otherwise please keep yourself on mute so we don't get the background noise. Okay, so why don't we go to the next one? This is a reminder of our participation principles. Slide's not moving for some reason. Elsa, any idea what's going on?
You might have to swap again.
Yeah,
Let me try this again.
Okay.
Elsa, do you mind trying your screen as well?
Yeah. Can you see this?
Yeah. Okay. So we will be transparent by sharing relevant information, ideas, and concerns with one another. We will seek inclusion by listening to as many voices as possible while embracing productive tensions and respectful disagreements. And we will communicate in good faith in a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. So by participating in this breakout group, we're all agreeing to those terms. Next slide, please. So here is our first poll. So Mijay or Elsa, okay, there we go. So Mijay just put into our chat the link to that poll. If you just click on the screen here, it won't do anything. So you have to click the link that's in the chat, or you can just type in what's at the top of the page here into your browser. And it will take you to a map that looks like the one on the screen. And then if you could just place a dot somewhere on there that the corridor is in yellow in the middle there, but wherever you're most familiar with, please put a little dot and it'll show up on our map. And this is also a test because we'll keep using this poll tool. So would love if everyone could try to join in here and make sure it's working for you so we can do the other questions as we go along. Anyone having problems with this, like trying to do it and not successfully getting it to work?
Rudy, I read that your you placed your marker in the wrong place. You can always clear your response and then add in another.
So yeah, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it will say clear last response, and you can fix it. All right, lots of Lincoln Square folks. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. So just as a reminder, this is the general concept that we're talking about here that we want to get your feedback on, so we know how to refine this and kind of keep getting into more detail in the study. The basic ideas are we're looking at some mixed use hubs, and then we're also looking at areas where there could be infill housing in between those hubs. So why don't we go to the next slide? We'll talk about each of the principles. So the first one I think is pretty easy for folks to agree to. This celebrate and enhance the corridor's unique assets. So for each of these principles, we're going to have a question of if you agree or partially agree or disagree. So we'll start with this one. If we go to the next slide, it will come up on your poll. So if you have that browser window still open, which I hope you do, then you can click agree, partially agree, or disagree with this draft planning principle to celebrate and enhance the corridor's unique assets. And if you partially agree or disagree, we're going to want to know why, because we want to make sure that we're gaining consensus on some of these principles. So I think this one's pretty straightforward. Does anyone partially agree or disagree that wants to talk about it? All right, let's move on to the next one then. Okay, so here's where we're getting into a little more depth. So we're talking about concentrating development into mixed use hubs. So rather than trying to maintain a strong commercial corridor for 5 whole miles contiguously, one idea that we're exploring is to concentrate that activity at specific nodes along the corridor into these mixed use hubs. So that's where we'd see, more commercial activity, more density. For sure, there would be housing integrated into that, but we'd want those to be supported by transit, already have some kind of cultural or commercial or other types of activities going on to build onto. And so we have some precedents here that we'll talk about in a second, but let's go to the poll of how we feel about this as a principle first. And again, if anyone partially agrees or disagrees, then we're going to want to know why. All right, so who's saying partially agree? Can you unmute and tell us why? Rudy, is it you?
Yeah, it is me. And the only reason is that with the main, like the 4700 block or Lincoln Avenue south of the Lawrence Western intersection is such a special area along a lot of this corridor. And even like the Vaughn as well when it intersects Western is just to be mindful of what that zoning might look like to protect the small, intimate stores and buildings that we have, and that way focusing more along, the north and southern areas of those intersections when it comes to creating these the concentration of development. Just that the way there is a good mix of larger buildings, probably will have more chains or franchises, where then protecting the independent corridors that exist along Western Avenue.
Yeah, very, very good points and well taken. This actually is a good segue to the fact that we will be having another round of focus groups where we'll actually be focusing on specific of these nodes, where we will have a whole focus group where we'll talk for a whole hour with people who are particularly interested in that area because they live, work, or otherwise interact with that area a lot, and we'll talk through different options about how to make these principles specific to those places. So, we're talking about kind of framework level ideas, but of course we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about how they're implemented to be context sensitive. So Omari, the lack of density is what is prohibiting development from traveling anywhere but that few blocks of Lincoln Ave, only affluent businesses. Omari, you want to elaborate on that? I'm not sure I get it.
Oh, so I was one of the persons who said agree well, I guess obviously because there's only that many votes, to concentrate development into mixed use hubs and especially Lincoln Square. So like right when Lincoln Avenue hits Western Avenue, it just like completely drops off of a cliff and becomes Western Ave for a few blocks. And then when Lincoln Avenue continues a few blocks northwest of there, it does not pick up at all the rhythm that Lincoln Square and that southern area has. And just like, you go on Lawrence, west of there, development immediately drops off. There's way more, it's less nice and built up, and it would be less attractive for, I don't know, to spur new development. It's less places you would want to hang out. So I think it's especially important to take advantage of all the transit that, because as you showed on the graphics, which were excellent. I mean, that really is a transit hub. I mean, right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you should sign up for our Lincoln Square focus group when we have that. Okay, so let's go into the next question, which is to elaborate on this one. So we have some examples of development that could be appropriate for some, obviously not all, of the mixed use hubs that we're talking about. So we'll have, so we're just allowing you to see them here, but we'll also have a poll where you can select the ones that you like. So why don't we go to the next slide? So they're really tiny on this page, but if you look on the browser page or on your phone, however you're accessing the survey, they're bigger. So you can select the types of development that you like, that you would like to see in at least one or two or maybe some of the mixed use hubs along Western Avenue. We got a lot of people that like B, which makes sense. So not all that dissimilar from Lincoln Square, a little taller of the buildings. But okay. This is interesting because it's a little different than what we saw when we did this question on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, the focus was more on the northern half of the corridor, just so that we could get a little bit more specific in our discussion. So for folks that chose A, would love to hear why you chose A, where you think it would be appropriate, and anything else that you liked about it. And we do know who voted for what, so we can call you out if we want to.
I voted for A and some other ones as well. I think the biggest difficulty in voting for these is that I guess it's kind of like you're voting for like the height of the building, like how many stories, as well as like the architectural design of it. So it's kind of there's none of the choices where I was like, oh wow, that's amazing, I'd want that right there. But I mean, at least number one shows that it's architecturally is one of my favorite out of them, including B is my other favorite. It's just, who doesn't like those kinds of buildings? But also I think it's starting to approach the right kind of density that needs to happen in the areas that you identified. In fact, I feel like a lot of people complain once you hit 4 stories. It's something like buildings from the 20th century, for some reason, that has to be the largest building that's allowed to get built in your neighborhood. And I would say this is even a modest height for some of the transit hubs. but I think it's at least starting to demonstrate the kind of density that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that I should have said this actually, but this is not necessarily about the design of the building. It's more of the scale and the types of uses that they would allow. We'll get into more of the design stuff when we get into the focus groups and start getting to be more specific about these areas. I don't know if that makes anyone change their mind. Duncan, you had your hand up.
I did. I picked A, and purely for density. You can't have retail without density. So that's that.
That brings up an interesting point. If folks have a certain height limit that people should have in mind, or a height minimum, I know that some folks.
Not for Western.
What was that?
Not for Western.
No.
Agreed.
Yeah, so some folks are nervous if you go over 4 stories, as was mentioned before. Some folks think we should be, going as high up as we possibly can to get, the most amount of housing and density for, as you're saying, for commercial success of these areas that have been suffering. Does anyone have strong feelings about density levels? All right, we can move on. We got more stuff to talk about here.
Well,
So-
I see Jeffrey raised his hand.
Oh, Jeffrey, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Sorry, my camera's not on. I'm on the old laptop at home, which doesn't have a working one. But it wasn't so much strong feelings as just, I think, one of the things that sometimes get overlooked in that sort of question about height too, that we see it a lot at the ward office is, it's not even a question of can you go over 4 stories. It's a question of do you get 4 stories or do you get 10? Because a lot of developers will tell you as soon as you go over 4 or 4 on a concrete platform, you can't do brick and stick. You're talking steel and stone at this point. The construction cost goes up substantially. A lot of private developers just won't even touch it because there's no break-even point for them until you get, into that 10, 12 story range. So there's a whole middle ground that I think people might have appetite for when you're talking about the neighborhood and the character of it, but it's very hard to find people who are willing to build it. So you end up with, well, do we want 4 stories or do we want double-digit stories? And that's a hard place to be in. Don't have a solution for it, just highlighting it as an element that sometimes gets overlooked in those discussions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would actually be curious what people felt if we proposed 10-story 10-story anything at areas along Western Avenue. That would be a very interesting discussion. Okay, so this next piece is related. It's all kind of part of the same framework, which is we talk about having concentrated commercial activity, more urban nodes, and then in between those nodes, because it's hard to support ground floor commercial for like this whole stretch in between nodes, which is why we're seeing in a lot of those areas a lot of vacant storefronts, which is obviously not great. There's been more appetite lately for having full, just 100% housing buildings with no ground floor no ground floor commercial space. So just units all the way down or a lobby on the ground floor, but not trying to support a storefront. That has been not super controversial, but there are certainly some people that are like, why would anyone want to live on Western Avenue anyway? And it certainly would need to come with, some of these other pieces of making the public realm more amenable to human life, more trees, just a little less of an aggressive highway type of feeling. So there's certainly parts that we can integrate into this, but there's a few pieces of this. I think in general, we want to see housing, more housing along the corridor, because we know that these neighborhoods are growing faster than the city as a whole, and there's demand for housing. A lot of these markets are very hot and they're starting to become very unaffordable. So we want to make sure we can get in housing where we can. So one option is in the mixed use nodes, which of course we want to do. This is a yes and situation. Another option to add into that is to have these full residential buildings in between. And then the third option, which we'll also talk about, is converting some of those vacant ground floor storefronts into residential units, maybe live, work, etc. So this one of new residential, why don't we go to the question if people agree with this as one of those strategies to increase housing. And if you partially agree or disagree, we'll ask you why. Not to pressure anyone into agree. That's not why I say that. But we do want to know. All right, who's partially agreeing that would like to tell us why? Oh. All right.
Catherine, one thing I wanted to say here is just the idea that encouraging something doesn't mean that it has to happen either. It only happens if, you know, there's support for it. It's so you know, if people don't think it could happen, then it won't. But at least it's not prohibited. I think is kind of a key thing.
Duncan, you have your hand up. Duncan, I can't hear you.
You might be muted still.
Duncan, are you muted? Is it an old hand that I didn't notice?
I'm
There we go.
struggling.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was struggling switching between the screens here. Yeah, I just think it's a really long stretch, and it's really stretching the retail, and to add the residential in there, it shores up some of the vacancy and you know, concentrates the retail into certain areas. It's just I find a really long stretch, and that's why I like this idea.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is when we think about what types of that infill housing could go in there. This, again, not the design necessarily, but the scale that would be in between the mixed use hubs. So if you go to the next one, that will be a similar type of poll where you can select the ones that you think would be appropriate, at least in some locations along the corridor. D, I think that's one that exists right now on Western Avenue. F, A, yep.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Are you asking should this be like the intensity standard in between the areas where it's the highest? So you're asking this is like the middle ground standard?
Yeah, so these would be the areas where it's, you know, not necessarily in the middle of one of these active commercial mixed use areas, but it's in these stretches in between. So, you know, there are areas that have single family homes on Western Avenue. There's nothing that's particularly tall anywhere. It seems like there's kind of a rather consistent level of density along most of Western Avenue, except where there's just like a lot of vacancy or like car stuff. But should we have some kind of structure where we're encouraging certain levels of density in different portions of the corridor? So I'm surprised, for example, to see like E and F, like those are pretty dense for not being in the middle of a mixed use hub. Is this, Duncan, do you have your hand up again, or is that from before?
I just took it down, sorry.
Okay, no worries. And we can go on to the next question too, and maybe dig into this further. So this is the one that's
Catherine?
about, yeah.
I want to say we have 2 and a half minutes left.
Yes. And this is our final one. So this is where we're talking about converting ground floor storefronts or commercial buildings into residential spaces. So if we could go to the poll, how do we feel about this one? And anyone should feel free to raise your hand, or if that isn't a function that's working from you, go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us what you like or don't like about this, particularly what you have concerns about that would help us refine this to make it better.
I'm happy to just weigh in that I did agree, but one of the things I think would be the design standards or the assistance on conversion. I think that, you see these spaces that they just did block glass back in the, the 80s that aren't necessarily the most attractive to walk by. So I think it would just be the standard that is set with the plan.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's go to the next slide, and that is about how they're being implemented. So Omari is saying only if there are facades worth keeping. Oh, that's a good point too. So if you have a solid building that you don't want to, some of the buildings along Western Avenue look like a strong wind might just blow them over. So those might not be the ones that we want to try to convert and invest further in. But yeah, take a look at these, and I mean, these are buildings that, for the ground floor at least, were repurposed for other uses. Yeah, no one liked C on Tuesday either. Chris was pretty jazzed about it though. All right, any reason in our last probably 30 seconds, any other comments on this as a principle or anything else that we missed? Oh, look, C's getting some love now. Final comments from anyone, because we're going to get kicked out in 3, 2, 1. All right, we'll see you on the other side.